Page.
Hi, everybody. Sharyl Attkisson here with Carter Page, and we are here to talk about his new book, Abuse and Power, which I think, in my opinion, is really one of the most important stories of our time and has not been well told until now. We're going to talk about that today. I got to know Carter Page professionally as an investigative reporter covering a story, and really I was blown away by the facts, as is the case when you cover stories where powerful interests are trying to shape them and you are not getting the true picture. He will talk about all of that today. Carter, can we start with you giving a little brief background of your education, where you went to school, and just very briefly, your job experience and career?
Yes, Sharyl. Well, thank you so much for doing this today, and it's great to be with you. So I grew up in Dutchess County, New York, and I received a nomination to the U.S. Naval Academy, which I started a week after graduating high school in 1989. And I completed Annapolis and was then commissioned in the U.S. Navy and served 5 years in the U.S. Navy. First as a arms control action officer doing international arms control negotiations in the Pentagon, and then I moved into served on a couple of surface warfare ships, a couple Navy ships in the Atlantic and in the Middle East.
Don't you have a couple of degrees?
I've been sort of a lifelong student. Although I joke around that when I was at Annapolis, I dropped out in my junior year, but I've always been studying. Just because I've been working kind of throughout that period, so I always kind of studied at night and go to night classes and stuff. But so, for example, when I worked in the Pentagon, I did my master's in national security at Georgetown, across the river from the Pentagon. And then while I was a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, I did my MBA in international business at New York University. And then
it's worth mentioning, because if people followed any of your story in the popular press, they likely heard that you were a not too intelligent, kind of hapless guy. And when I read about your background and learned more about you, I really thought that was a clear misrepresentation of what you had done. And then I think we also ought to start, maybe at the beginning of this conversation, with how you came to work in Russia, because if not for your presence in Russia for business at some point in time, they may not have had what some would call an excuse to wiretap you to, what some would say, get to President Trump. So explain, first of all, why you're in Russia. A lot of people act like it's so suspicious if someone goes to Russia or does business there, when actually many thousands of business people from the United States live and work in Russia.
Yeah, well, it's ironic in a lot of ways, Sharyl, because I'm a free markets guy, and actually that was my other degree. I did my doctorate at University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, looking at Middle and Near East affairs, and thinking about how I did a big research project on the tensions between capitalist and socialist approaches in various emerging market societies. And one of the case studies I did was on Russia. So, but I have my first time to Russia was actually during the late Soviet period in the summer of 1991, just a few months before the end of the Soviet Union. I was a part of the first exchange program between the U.S. Naval Academy and the Soviet Naval Academy as well. So I've been working over there in various capacities. Again, as I mentioned, when I was in the Pentagon, I did a lot of U.S.-Russia arms control negotiations. And then when I got out, while I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, I did a research project with the Central Asian Caspian Sea basin. And of course, Russia is a one of the countries on the Caspian Sea. So I've done a lot of work in developing markets in general, but with Russia in particular as one of a key emerging market, I did a lot of work there, and eventually, it's sort of on the interface between capitalist and socialist type approaches with the end of communism that President Reagan worked on in terms of transition to free market societies. That was some of the, I was really inspired by that growing up, and I decided I wanted to contribute to that process in terms of.
There was a time in the not too distant past when people who worked in Russia for the United States were not viewed automatically with suspicion, because this was encouraged by our government as we tried to help them move from what was the Soviet Union to something more, we hoped, to a market economy like ours. And then were you based there for a financial company and lived there?
Yeah, me and another guy opened it was Merrill Lynch, the U.S. investment bank. We opened their office there in 2004, and it's kind of related to the overall transition to the markets approaches, because in 1998 Merrill Lynch was one of the few banks that decided they're gonna, there was a big worldwide emerging markets crisis, and Russia got hit particularly hard there, and Merrill decided that they're going to shut down the office. So fast forward 6 years later, and Russia is then the biggest, fastest growth market in the world. And there's a lot of privatization going on, and, again, sort of more of a transition towards free market approaches. And so me and another guy ended up heading over there to open the Merrill Lynch office.
And last point on this, and this all plays a big part in the story of what ultimately happened to you. But of course, it is not unusual if you are a businessman in the former Soviet Union, because of the way the economy works, if you are doing business with Russians, you are in essence coming into contact with Russian government officials, and you are in essence coming into contact, knowingly or not, oftentimes with people who spy for Russia, Russians who actually work or provide intelligence with the Russian government. Is that right?
Absolutely. And again, I had a philosophy at the time that it's useful to tell the truth and help serve your country to the greatest extent that you can. I mean, that was my philosophy when I served in the Navy throughout those years. And I had, through a lot of different work I had done, various contacts in the U.S. intelligence community. And some people I know asked me for help. So again, I've always served my country in various capacities, whether it's as an Eagle Scout or, Catholic altar boy, sort of serving my community, and as well as in the Navy. And when I was asked, I was more than happy to help, again, with the view that it's useful to provide accurate and insightful information. And since I had, lived and worked there throughout, for now it's been over 25 years, it'd be useful to provide some insights, and which could be helpful to our country.
So you, having been a source in the past for information for our FBI and CIA, ended up really being the thing that drove the nail in the coffin in this operation that the government had against you and essentially the Trump campaign. We'll get to that in a moment. But the book, Abuse and Power, tells this whole story. Where can people order the book, Carter?
Well, there's a website, carterpagebook.com, and that gives all kinds of options in terms of where, whatever bookseller you prefer, Amazon and the full range there. So it's all available at carterpagebook.com.
And in case people don't know who I am, which is understandable if not, I'm an investigative reporter with a history working at PBS, CNN, CBS. I have an independent show now called Full Measure on Sinclair, a Sunday TV show that you can find online. And I've written, my new book is called Slanted: How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism. And Carter Page and I have something in common. Our stories are different, but they both involve the government having surveilled us in an improper and or unlawful way. That's what chapter 9 of Carter's book focuses on. It's called Overcoming the Abuses Against American Democracy. Talks a lot about surveillance. I'm going to read just a short passage from that, and then you can provide some context. You wrote in this chapter, the illegitimate case against me reveals several other forms of dysfunction, talking about the government spying on you. When I was targeted with 4 applications for FISA surveillance, you say, the applications were filed under Title I, which defined me as a possible agent of a foreign power. Now, as an aside, you have provided intelligence for intelligence agencies, but they're secretly wiretapping you, claiming that you could be spying for the Russians. And you write, but I wasn't the only target. With my surveillance, as noted, the federal government could make 2 hops from me. In other words, listen in on people who are talking to you and people who are communicating with them, which would include FBI reviewing your private data from Steve Bannon, for example, and Steve Bannon's contact, Donald Trump. In this respect, the Carter Page warrants were a direct assault on the First and Fourth Amendment right of all Americans. And you say this isn't a partisan issue. People from across the ideological spectrum see it as an American issue. So as this unfolded, when did you start to believe that they weren't just after you, they were trying to get to perhaps President Trump or others on the campaign?
Well, it's interesting, Cheryl, because I actually, through my contacts in the intelligence community, I had someone give me a heads up even before the first, one of the main defamatory articles, which was used by the Comey FBI to get this fraudulent warrant. Way back in September 2016, a contact of mine with ties to the intel community told me that the Democrats had paid quote unquote opposition research people to dig up dirt on then candidate Trump and his supporters, such as me. So I knew that they were in the process of trying to come up with these lies, primarily with the initial idea of just pumping it out to the media and getting people to, a real election interference campaign to deceive American voters. And this is, again, just a couple of months, less than a couple of months between the 2016 election. And then sure enough, on September 23rd, 2016, even though I'm getting all kinds of questions from reporters, finally, so Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, they're all asking me about these same false allegations, which the Democrats had paid for, and their consultants were trying to push out in every way possible. Finally, they found someone who's either or a media organization that's either unethical enough or gullible enough, or possibly both, to go ahead and publish this article on Friday, September 23rd, 2016. And really the rest is history, because again, this is one of the elements and part of this election interference where these false stories were used as a way, part of the fraudulent FISA affidavits against myself as a way of spying on so many people I was associated with, other Trump campaign volunteers back in 16.
So let's say that, by way of summary, the things that were said about you, in part to get these wiretaps under false pretenses, these secret wiretap applications said that you were either already acting as a Russian spy or imminently about to become one. People may not know those are the qualifications. You cannot wiretap somebody in our society. You're not supposed to, just on a hunch or on a fishing expedition. You're not allowed to. You have to already have evidence in hand some other way that they've either already acted as a Russian spy for another country, terrorist, or imminently about to become one. And the very fact that they wiretapped you 4 times over the course of a year without any evidence to charge you with anything or do anything about it seems to belie the notion that you were imminently about to do anything, by their own claims. But part of this evidence claimed that you had visited Russia and made improper contacts with certain Russian government officials as a liaison for the Trump campaign. Is that how a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think an important, interesting insight, and it goes back to your personal story in terms of having to deal with similar things like this. But I know as part of your ongoing battles in the courts related to this, it's very similar to what we've seen over the last several years for Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham, right? You have been making various allegations with a lot of basis to it. And unfortunately, people within the US government, Department of Justice, which handles all civil litigation and investigations such as this, they unfortunately have not been very supportive at all in terms of providing the full information about what happened. And it's precisely the same thing that Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham and so many of his colleagues in Congress have been fighting for so hard. So, I mean, I think we're all in this battle together, and it's very much the focus of this chapter here in terms of understanding everything that's at stake and how it affects so many people, such as yourself, myself, leaders in Congress that are just trying to protect civil liberties. And so it's a very long, complicated story, and I've tried to make it as simple and as understandable as possible with this chapter, while also illustrating what exactly is at stake, just given the civil rights abuses or potential abuses they were all susceptible here.
Well, let's call it the ultimate catch-22, when it is the very intelligence community and part of the government committing the abuses, but also in charge of holding the perpetrators accountable. And you find they have no desire to do that or to provide the information that would allow us to do that in court. They hold all the cards. And this is what's so dangerous about it, because it didn't just happen to you and it didn't just happen to me. My information says there were many operations. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved over short time periods and over longer time periods and other administrations, not just one administration. There are probably too many people to count who have been involved in potential abuses of their constitutional rights, and we may never know. You also wrote in Chapter 9, the senior Department of Justice lawyer, the Inspector General Michael Horowitz, revealed that the breakdown in surveillance state has been much worse than we originally realized. In an examination done, you say, of 29 of these FISA wiretap applications that were reviewed for possible abuse after they learned about yours, all 29 had serious deficiencies. Think about this. And in several cases, the Inspector General could not even find the documents that show the FBI's mandatory processes were followed. The Inspector General revealed something that has been apparent to many for a long time. You write, the whole system of secret surveillance is broken. And that's what you say, getting at the heart of how this impacts people if they say, so this happened to Carter Page, maybe he'll get redress in the end. But this is much bigger than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are so many different dimensions and challenges related to it. And again, it's a little bit of a spectrum. I think, as you're saying, this is a serious problem that's happened for, impacts all Americans on the one hand, but also, very often, and this is a core element of First Amendment liberties and First Amendment constitutional rights. In addition to having freedom of the press, there's also, freedom of thought and freedom of peaceable assembly, and so many freedoms inherent in the First Amendment. And unfortunately, what you have sometimes is when people have a different view, or when journalists such as yourself, might say something which is not exactly what the powers that be. And again, the incident that started with me happened during the Obama-Biden administration. And, sometimes you have pretty harsh political actors working to achieve their political objectives.
Okay, this is a great story, the one I think you're about to tell. This is another bit of wow insight you gave me when I interviewed you for my program Full Measure. Because people may say, why target Carter Page? Well, there's some evidence that they were looking for anybody surrounding President Trump. Best case scenario, you can say they really thought Trump was a Russian spy, and so they were just looking for Russian ties. Worst case scenario, they were just looking for excuses, anybody who'd been to Russia or had experience in that region, to try to justify a wiretap to be able to listen in on them. But you, with your experience with some in the FBI, they talked with you in the time period, was it the Boston bombing?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Go ahead, take it from there.
Well, it's funny. Back right after the Boston bombing in the first half of 2013, I was helping the FBI with a particular Russian spy case in New York, and unfortunately, I was writing some various ideas in terms of the certain approaches that should be taken. I had just recently written a little academic article, and I had offered this, when as in one of my meetings with the FBI agents, I had mentioned my various perspectives to them. And I think what we've seen is just, a real severe bias. This big Inspector General report, which led into, this major investigation, the initial FISA abuse report as to these abuses that the Trump campaign and myself that were inflicted upon us. I mean, that was a very serious issue, but unfortunately, it extends far beyond that. And one of the elements of that, and one of the big debates, is the Inspector General Horowitz, an Obama appointee. He said that, well, we don't find any political bias there. Well, it was an interesting conclusion, and I know a lot of people who actually know the full facts have pushed back on this really hard. But I mean, on the face of it, there's a ton of evidence of political bias. And unfortunately, and again, it's very similar to what we're talking about, things that you've had to deal with, that Chairman Lindsey Graham and so many members of Congress have had to deal with in terms of getting the truth. It's part of this. It's only part of the story. And if you're just getting, I always refer to it as garbage in, garbage out, right? So this Inspector General report, U.S. Department of Justice, they interviewed 100 witnesses and read over 1 million documents as part of their overall review. Unfortunately, a lot of the same perpetrators were the same people they're talking with. So I think it's understandable where, if you're only talking to many of these same bad actors, of course they're going to say, oh, we're not biased at all, And I was begging them to let me provide some input. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, this is another example of civil liberties not really being respected, number one, but also the rule of law not being respected, because there is the Privacy Act of 1974, which gives American citizens, if the government is keeping records on you, you have the right to review that information, particularly before they distribute it to the entire world. And so there are a lot of problems in that December 2019 Inspector General report, and I thought it was really essential that I have some help set the record straight. And so that's when I decided to write this book, basically, just because this story is just so incomplete, and I just wanted to tell more of the full story in terms of everything that happened as part of the election interference campaign and President Trump's first campaign.
But take us back. Wasn't there a sarcastic remark you made to one of these FBI people some years ago that you thought may have stuck in their craw a little bit and made them maybe, more vindictive when it came to coming after you?
Yeah, again, it's typical, freedom of speech, freedom of ideas. And I wrote an op-ed which was actually very critical of the Obama administration's policy. And one thing in particular that I tried to argue in this article is, instead of there were a lot of mistakes in foreign policy and in a justice system context during the Obama administration. But if they had paid more attention and looked for more constructive approaches, so many threats, so many national security threats to America could have been completely avoided. So there was both a, calling people out for some of their mistakes in terms of this academic article, which got no real attention other than me talking to the FBI agents about it. And unfortunately, one thing led to another, and just about a year and a half later, so those were a meeting in the middle of 2013 after some help I was giving them.
Way before this current scandal, yeah.
Yes, and then a year and a half later, in January of 2015, Eric Holder, Preet Bharara, and John Carlin, senior DOJ officials in the Obama-Biden administration, come out with this indictment of 3 alleged Russian spies. And unfortunately, they gave highly sensitive information in an open indictment. And again, I had supported them and given them a lot of accurate information. And the way the information was presented, number one, I had no forewarning that this would be taken to the next level in terms of making this a public indictment and actually filing these charges. But even worse is the fact that some of the things that I had laid out and told them in my original meeting with them, and particularly the way they juxtaposed it with some other information in this indictment, really, misportrayed the information I had given them, which one thing leads to another, and unfortunately, with not a very professional way of managing that case, and or recognizing someone who had long supported the U.S. intelligence community and the justice system for many, many years, just really essentially putting my life at risk, because eventually, and this, I explain it all in the book, and it's along in some of the prior chapters, but it's an ongoing sort of spy thriller, if you will, of my back and forth. And although I was supporting them on the one hand, just also calling them out in some of my meetings with them, explaining the mistakes that had been made, and unfortunately, voicing or telling the truth and voicing an honest opinion made me even more of a personal target for political reasons than I could have imagined.
So closing the loop on the violation of law, I think there were probably numerous ones, but one that we know of for sure now that happened against you by FBI. It is required when they make these secret wiretap applications that if the person they're trying to get a wiretap against, like you, has a relationship with the federal government as a source, as you did, you had helped the FBI and the CIA, that must be disclosed. That's in the FBI rules, among other things, that they didn't follow. And when you publicly implied or stated or discussed with the FBI in a letter to them, hey, I've helped you in the past. Please come to me if you have any questions about this. This is ridiculous, when it was being leaked that you were some kind of spy. They withheld that information from the court. And there was apparently an exchange within the FBI and the CIA in which the CIA confirmed to the FBI you had been a source. And that was the trigger that should have forced them to disclose this important information to the court, which might have made the court say, something seems a little funny here. Why would a guy that knows he's being watched, that has helped us in the past, be spying supposedly, on behalf of Russia? But instead, this FBI attorney who's pleading guilty to this admits to having doctored the information, forged the document, and said that you had not been, according to the CIA, a past source. And that's, I guess, what really makes everything fall apart in a very official way in terms of what they did to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Again, this is a very powerful FBI attorney who was involved in this particular part of the charade. But I think if you read closely the indictment, and as you're referring to, me giving a heads up, the FBI in that case, 2 days after this defamatory article planted by the Democrats in September 2016, on Sunday, September 25th, 2016, I sent a letter to then FBI Director James Comey, just explaining the truth and trying to explain reality to this guy. And I said at the end of this letter, you know, I've been in touch with you and been in touch with the CIA going back a long time. And please, if you will, if you know, this is obvious how ridiculous these allegations are. If you have any remaining questions, if you have any sort of doubts whatsoever, do not hesitate to contact me. Not only did they not contact me during that period, over the 5+ months following that is when they, Mr. Comey and Sally Yates, submitted the first 2 false, highly inaccurate FISA warrants to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in Washington. And unfortunately, not only were they not talking to me, they were instead dealing with a DNC-funded consultant who was doing this major smear campaign against then candidate Trump and his supporters such as me, and leaking like crazy to the media. I mean, there is just so much wrongdoing encapsulated in there, and it's encouraging that some initial steps have been taken in terms of reestablishing the rule of law, but unfortunately there's just so much more that needs to be uncovered, and I hope this book provides some initial impetus in terms of some of the major problems, and I just wanted the American people to know what the full truth is underlying this completely incredible attack.
The abuse is called abuse. The book is called Abuse and Power. And, you know, the notion that the Inspector General wouldn't speak with you during his investigation, that when you tried to get the FBI to talk to you to clear things up as they were targeting you, they wouldn't speak to you. It reminds me a little bit when the government operations against me were confirmed. I never dreamed this was happening. I too had intel sources that alerted me, because I would never have imagined the government was spying on me and other journalists. But I later learned the FBI, once CBS News announced the intrusions and that their forensics had proven the remote intrusions had happened, and we've had a half dozen forensics exams that have shown various aspects of what government IP addresses were used and so on. But I learned through a Freedom of Information Act request, the FBI is withholding most of the information from me about my own case. They opened a case when CBS announced there had been these intrusions into my computers, and they listed me as the victim, never contacted me, never tried to help me, never told me there was a case. I wasn't even aware of it, never did anything about it as far as I'm concerned, and I can only assume it's because there were some contacts inside that knew that this was involving government agents. It was not a rogue case involving outsiders. But I don't know, it just reminds me when you say, here you are waiting at the door to talk to them and to help clear your name and sort things out, which you have a right to do, and you can't even get their attention as you're being smeared. One really interesting facet when I interviewed you for my program was, and I didn't know the answer to this question before I asked it, but I even forget how it came up, but basically, had you, when we spoke before, ever met Donald Trump?
I had never then when we last spoke, and I still have never had the privilege of meeting him. And, you know, it's unfortunately, I just being totally misportrayed. I've been a man on the run, and I refer to it as my international fugitive years. Unfortunately, with those same types of problems and challenges, which are created by this massive government footprint coming down on your head like just like a Goliath. Unfortunately, and I know you've had similar battles in terms of trying to reestablish justice with your own case. It's just been an uphill battle nonstop. So, but no, I've never had the opportunity. And unfortunately, this is one of the core problems of the election interference campaign during the Obama-Biden administration. Is unfortunately they smear various people, and then it creates huge legal liability for anyone that wants to communicate or
Right.
maintain a relationship. And I talk about this in the book with certain individuals. So essentially, by the time the 2016 election came around, I was just a complete international pariah, and almost everyone I knew wanted to have nothing to do with me. Not just high level people within the Trump campaign, including the candidate himself, but basically everyone I knew. And so the one exception to that was a professor from Cambridge University in the UK, this gentleman by the name of Stefan Halper, and has now been revealed. Unfortunately, he was part of what's known as Spygate, where government operatives were looking to surveil and be part of this spying operation against the Trump campaign, unfortunately. And so, along the lines of, well, have you met them? Well, I wasn't really meeting with anyone with the exception of this one guy who I thought was, a good, potentially a good-hearted person with his heart in the right place. And little did I know that he was a high-paid government operative hired by during the Obama-Biden administration to spy on the Trump campaign and the operations of the campaign at that time.
Well, it just adds to the perception of the absurdity that you would be some high level Russian spy working for the Trump campaign with Trump, who is a Russian spy in their view, and you had never met the man. I think you also told me you'd never spoken to him on the phone, never emailed him, nothing. So,
yeah, communication. Yep.
Also, I wondered, as of December, when the Horowitz report came out, December 2019, there was never any doubt, even if people had some doubt, that improper things had been done to you specifically, and obviously with bigger implications. And now that there's been a guilty plea by that FBI attorney, the former attorney, I believe his name is Kevin Kleinsmith, there's been a guilty plea in your case showing that you've been abused. Has anybody reached out to you from government, Department of Justice? Is there been any attempt to remedy this? Now, I know there's no way to, as they say, get your reputation back or go back in time. And sadly, even a payment of money will not be, redressed in a significant way. But I guess that's the only thing the government could potentially do. Has someone reached out to you with a giant apology and some offer to try to remedy some of these wrongs?
Well, again, this is somewhat similar to your case, Sharyl, where it's been a long, ongoing battle, which just continues and continues. And I've been fighting this, going back to the time 4 years ago when I wrote that letter to James Comey. I've just been fighting for the truth and fighting for some small semblance of justice. And so, unfortunately, I've been in various litigation myself up against the massive Department of Justice. And part of the problem is, this is literally the largest law firm in the world. Countless, I think 10,000 plus lawyers with unlimited resources, with the ability to just achieve their individual and in many cases political objectives. And although there have been important steps forward, my experience throughout this time is that there's been very little, very few steps or very little willingness to right these wrongs. And I will, however, mention one small glimmer of hope, and it also relates back to Mr. Kleinsmith. So this month, in August 2020, was the first time, again, we've talked about the Privacy Act violations, all the FISA abuse, criminal activities by government operatives, such as the one we were just discussing. This was the first time that some steps by DOJ were actually shown to actually respect my legal rights and constitutional rights. There's this one slight legal trivia, but there's this one law called the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And many aspects of this law have been completely disregarded, even though it was widely understood that all these criminal acts had been conducted against myself and as a way of damaging President Trump. But it was the first time this month that the Department of Justice took some very limited steps to begin remedying this situation. So it's a small initial tiny glimmer of hope, and we'll have to see how everything plays out with that. But again, I was slightly encouraged. Again, so that law, it says, part of it, one of the tenets of the law says you have the right to be treated with fairness and with respect for the victim's dignity and privacy. And I think that one sentence in this U.S. law is the absolute opposite of everything that I've had to deal with, and so many other people have had to deal with, unfortunately, over the last. So you're saying
someone has reached out to you, and can you say specifically, I don't fully understand the impact of what you just described on your case?
Well, no real impact yet. All I will say is, people have often talked about the boomerang, where all these bad acts by government officials creating incalculable damages for innocent people such as myself, various Trump supporters. This is the first time that just basic legal rights, again, the right to be treated with fairness and with respect. So yes, you're right. It's a point well taken. There's certainly a tremendous amount more that needs to be done, but this is the very first small, tiny glimmer of hope that perhaps some people somewhere within the Department of Justice are now acting ethically and in accordance with the rule of law. So I'm very encouraged by that one tiny leap, tiny step, and hopefully there are giant leaps in the period to come.
So my last question along these lines, am I to understand that even today, at least as we speak, you've been suing the Department of Justice to try to get some of these wrongs remedied somehow? And despite the fact that the Inspector General came out last December and found these violations, and despite the fact there's no dispute about it, that the FISA court itself has acknowledged in a further investigation these abuses, you're still fighting in court? They haven't come to you and said, you were right, there's nothing to fight anymore, we give up?
Well, I mean, let me say this. I have a few initial steps that I've tried taking. Unfortunately, the first time, originally I filed a case in the Southern District of New York, and I talked about this in an earlier chapter as well. But unfortunately, I made various claims against the government, and then it was during the Rosenstein Sessions years at the Department of Justice. And unfortunately, it was a continuation of either false or misleading court pleadings by DOJ. And little did I know when I first filed my case 3 years ago in September of 2017, that a few months later, through a great investigation by Chairman Lindsey Graham of the Senate Judiciary, as well as then Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, uncovered that none other than Mr. Rosenstein himself was one of the people who signed this false court pleading against me in June of 2017, well into the Trump administration already. So again, it's highly disappointing, but I bear in mind that there's a lot of other Trump supporters who have been feeling similar problems. For example, General Flynn, and again, there are certain steps that may be taken, but it's a big catch-up game right now, and we'll have to see how everything plays out, because after so many years of wrongdoing, we're in the process of rebuilding. And obviously, now that we're just a couple of months before the 2020 election, I'm hopeful that there can be some progress, because certainly if you listen to, for example, last week, Sally Yates, another person who signed 2 false FISA warrants to trample my civil and legal rights. She was a big political operative at the big national convention of the DNC. And what's the significance of the DNC? Well, that's the same organization that funded and helped put together this terrible dossier, which was part of the serious civil rights abuses which I had to endure.
The Democratic National Committee. And again, for people who don't know, when you sign off on these wiretaps, I'm told by my inside sources, you would normally stay far, far away from a political competitor. You just don't do it. And then if you feel you must, for some overriding reason, that would have to go all the way to the top. This is, they're telling me in theory, to the President of the United States, because it's such a sensitive matter that they would have to examine that. And then you would want to look at the wiretap if you sign off on it and make crystal clear that all of the processes have been followed. You would want to do that personally, not just sign it as they say they kind of did. Now the people at the top are implying that they were fooled by the people under them, when in fact it's their responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. So anyway, wow, what a story. And you said carterpage.com is the place with all the options for the book.
carterpagebook.com, yep.
carterpagebook.com, great. The book is called Abuse and Power. The story is amazing. Thank you, Carter Page.
Thank you so much, Sharyl.
Here are some of the current best-selling nonfiction books, according to the Washington